Hey everybody, in this video we're going to be showing you a fantastic method of painting Lord Elrond from the Middle-earth strategy battle game by Games Workshop. Now Elrond is a real fan favourite from the Lord of the Rings movie trilogy, and in this video we're going to be showing you how to paint him with his equipment as he's seen in the Battle of the Last Alliance at the end of the Second Age. Now the interesting thing about this colour scheme is that it actually has a very summery feel to it, as all the elves at this time are in their kind of summer of their time at Middle-earth, which is a cool little feature about the colour scheme of the equipment. He has a very distinctive gold banded armour, but also some green and some blue, meaning that you can use all the methods and techniques that we're going to use in this video to also paint regular high elves as well. We hope you enjoy this video, and we'll see you at the desk. When it comes to painting Elrond, we can approach painting him very much like many other high elves in the Second Age. But as you're building a miniature, there is a key thing to be aware of, and that is that there's actually a bit of a weak point in the middle of his sword blade. Now, the sword is obviously very thin, but just along here, there's a bit of a point where it's very easy for it to break. So just bear that in mind as you're assembling the miniature, and you might encounter this sort of thing every now and then with a kit. It's easy to spot when it is one of these weak points, because if it breaks, what you'll get is a bit of a crater sort of appearance to it. So it's quite easy to stick it back together. You just need a little bit of super glue and a bit of emery board, which is what we used for ours, but just bear that in mind, it is quite fragile. But anyway, what we're going to do is approach painting him like any other high elf in the Second Age, which means what we want to do is start out with that pale gold, and it's quite distinctive pale gold for this. And to do it, what we need to do is pick an undercoat colour that's sympathetic to the paints we're going to be using here, which in this case means going for a neutral grey. I've used some standard grey from ColourForge here, but if you want to go for Citadel, then something like Mechanica standard grey is great. From the Army Painter, uniform grey is also great. Whatever you choose though, what we're going to do is start out with that gold armour, and here what we need is a pale gold. Now I'm going to use some glistening gold for this, but if you want to go for a Citadel paint, then Liberator gold is similar to it, and whichever you choose, what we need to do is just start out by getting some onto the palette. So what we need is a little dollop of this. So there we go, and then to apply it, you want to go for a medium-sized brush. And I'm going to use one from Artisopus here. I've got a size 1. From Citadel, it's something like a medium layer. That sort of size is what we want to go for. And with this, as ever, it's just a matter of making sure it's nicely thinned down on your palette, and then what we're looking for is all the banded armour across the miniature. Just need to block it in. Now, it is going to be a little bit translucent as we start applying it, but we need this to be as smooth as possible. So when you're painting it on, just allow it to dry completely and then put on a second thin coat in the exact same way once that first one is completely dry. Once you finish applying that gold, we can then move on to the next step, which is going to be to apply a wash over the top of it to give it some shading. And this is where we're going to do something really unusual, because we're actually going to wash it with a green wash. Now, you might be wondering why, but this goes into one of the things that I think are so cool about the Lord of the Rings movies and what makes them so special, and that is the depth and attention paid to all the different cultures that appear in it. So the High Elves, for example, in the Second Age, they're seen to be in the summer of their time in Middle-earth, which means all the colours that they have there are all sort of summery, whereas by comparison, if you look at the Third Age Elves, like the Galadrim, you see in the Battle of Helm's Deep, they're wearing much more autumnal colours because the elves are coming to the end of their time there. So I think this is really cool, and it's something we're going to incorporate onto the miniature just here. So we need that sort of greenish wash onto the gold, and if you look carefully at the props, you'll certainly see it, even though it sounds strange. The colour I'm going to use here is Necrosis green wash, though if you want to go for Citadel, you want to use something like Athonian Camoshade. So we're looking at sort of like an olive, sort of brownish kind of green. And to take the edge off it, I'm going to thin it down with a medium to ensure it retains the same properties. So I've got some Lahmian medium for this. And what we need to do is mix them together. Now on the palette, I've already got my Necrosis green wash, so here we go. And so I'm just going to get some Lahmian medium. Using my size 1 brush once again for this, I'm looking for a roughly 50-50 mix as well. So there we go, just get them next to each other on the palette and mix them together to thin it down to this sort of strength here. And with that prepared then, all we need to do is apply it directly over all of this gold. And this includes all the little bits and pieces that are gold here. So we start with the banding around here. What we want to do is just apply it like this, so it's not too thick. So just manipulating it around to make sure it's not overwhelming it, but getting that greenish tint in the recesses. So all we need to do is apply this now all over the gold and then give it around about 15 minutes to dry. That wash is dry, and you can see it's given us that nice subtle hint of that green. And remember, it is meant to be subtle here, because what we want to have the effect of is that you see the gold and you know it's a very unusual kind of gold colour, but it's when you look at it really closely, that's when you start to get that green coming through. But what we want to do before we move on is just emphasise it and to make it a bit clearer to the human eye in certain areas. So what we're going to do is apply Necrosis green wash once again, but this time in a much more controlled fashion, and this time without the medium to dilute it. So I've gone for a smaller brush now. I've got a size 0 here, and I'm just going to get some of the paint on its own. With this, we just want a small amount on the brush, making sure you've got that good point on there. And what we're aiming to do is to paint it into areas in shadow. So we're looking at the bands that go underneath other ones. So if we look at these ones along here, what that means is painting it in this kind of recess just here, directly beneath the one above it. So it's just a matter of going around all these bands and doing this on each one. And there we are. You can see with that green hue is just a little bit stronger. And so now we're going to move on to some of the details. And we'll come back to that gold later on to finish it off. But before we do so, what we now need to do is start base coating some other colours that can all share the same wash. And it's going to be a black wash. So what we're going to do is start out with the green fabric that appears on him. And here we need a nice dark green. I'm going to use some Wyvern green for this. But if you want to go for Citadel, then you just want a dark green. So something like Caliban green is great. Whatever you choose, what we need to do is get this ready for base coating. So I've gone back to my size 1 brush here. You can see I've got some on my palette already. As ever, we just need to make sure it's thinned down, and then there's some particular areas that we need to block in with this. Now, the main one is nice and clear, and that is the fabric that's lower down on the body and appears beneath the banded armour. So we're looking at these parts of the fabric just here. We want to block them in entirely with 2 thin coats, just being careful as you get close to that gold. So just taking your time around there, letting the bristles go up to the bands but not onto them. Now, in addition, there's a very small bit that's a bit tricky to get to, so you might want to switch to a smaller brush here. That's the sash going around his waist. Now, it can be a bit tricky spotting this compared to all the banded armour because it looks so similar, but we're looking at this area around here and just above the leather belt, so up to just there. Once you've got that green blocked in, we can then move on to the next major colour for the fabric, which is going to be the blue. And here we want a nice deep, rich blue. So I'm going to use some Kantor blue for this. And to apply it, I'm sticking to that size 1 brush, though feel free to go for a smaller one when you're doing around the shoulders because it can become a little bit intricate around there. Whatever you choose, as ever, it's just a matter of making sure the paint's nicely thinned down. And once you've got it nice and smooth, all you got to do is start blocking in this area. So we're looking at the main cloak on the back of him now, so all the way around here. And you can see you just need to be careful as you get close to those parts that we've done so far. In particular, the gold, especially around here, just carefully bringing it up to that part there. Now it does come up over the shoulders too, so we want to follow it down here as well. Again, just being careful of that gold. And there we are, the blue's blocked in as well, and so now we've got a few more colours that we need to apply before we go onto that black wash. So first of all, what we now need is a nice warm brown for a few details, and here I'm going to use some Moonfang Brown. Then we need a darker brown, and here I'm going to use some Thondia Brown. With that done, we can then move on to adding in the silver detail for things like the chainmail and the blade of his sword. Here what we're going to need is a nice bright silver, so I'm going to be using some plate armour. If you want to go for a Citadel one, you're looking at something like iron hand steel, so a nice medium silver like that. But first of all, what we need is that Moonfang Brown, and to apply it, I'm going for a size 0 brush here, because with this, it's actually some quite small details that we're looking to pick out. So definitely make sure you get that paint thinned down and really under control in the palette, really adding that water to it as you need to, just testing to see how well it's flowing, and then you're ready to go. And with this, first of all, what we're looking for is the belt. So this is actually a bit hidden amongst the sash, but it's this texture that appears just towards the top of it, just under his arm, looking at this area just here. Now, in addition, what we want to paint here is going to be the leather of his scabbard. So we're looking at this area here, just again being careful of that gold as you block all of this in, especially around the end of it just there. And also we've got a little bit of detail on his sword. Now, it depends on the pose you're going for here, but on the blade had half ank. If you can see the grip of it, paint it with this colour too. In this pose, both hands are covering it, so there's not really anything to pick out here. But if you're doing the mounted version, you can see a bit, so be sure to get that as well. Once that's done, you're then ready to move on to some Thondia Brown, and with this we've got a few details to base coat, starting out with his gloves, so we want to get the leather of these around here, but also we've got his boots to do, and also this is a great colour for base coating all of his hair. And then finally we're ready to base coat the silver using plate armour, and this includes the sword blade of course, and remember to be careful as you're going along here, but also be sure to get all the chainmail as well. And with all those colours now blocked in, we're ready to move on to that black wash. And here what I'm going to use is some Oblivion black wash, but if you want to go for Citadel, then Nuln Oil is of course a great choice, but any black wash will do. And with this, what we need to do is introduce it onto these new colours that we've added since we did that gold. So basically everything but the gold. So that means we just need to be careful in the application. For that reason, I'm starting with that size 1 brush, but it's a good idea to have a smaller one on hand when you need to manipulate the wash around the more intricate details. But for this, what I recommend you do is just load up a fair generous amount like this. Pick a good starting point, that's a distance away from the armour. So on these green robes, for example, we could start down here. This means it's nice and easy to apply it over all these features, working it into all the nooks and crannies to get that shading. But you can see then, as we get closer to the gold, there's much less paint on the brush, and therefore it becomes really easy to manipulate it, just bringing it up to those bands, but not onto them. That black wash is now completely dry, and so with that we can begin the next phase of painting the miniature, which is going to be to start to do some layering to brighten things back up again. And for this, what we're going to do is start out with that gold armour, and here you need to return to the original gold that you used. So in this case, that's going to be glistening gold, but go for whichever one that you used when you're starting out painting your miniature. And with this time in the application, we need to be much more careful. So definitely make sure you're using a small brush. I'm using my size 0 here. And with this, the first thing to do is to make sure you thin the paint down to a point where it's a little bit thinner than that original base coat. So making sure it's a little bit inky really. We're sort of going for this sort of consistency. See, a little bit runny, it's flowing around quite easily. Then a key important thing is to make sure you remove excess off on some tissue and just load up a small amount, because this way it'll appear you don't have much paint on your brush, but you can see if I move it around the palette, I'm getting lots appearing there. So that's ideal for what we want here. This way we've got that control as to where exactly we want it. So what we need to do here is to reapply it onto the gold detail, but at this time we're looking to avoid recesses. So if we look at the bands around here, what we're aiming to do is to paint it into these flatter areas in the middle. So we're looking at this sort of area just here. We want to apply a thin coat along areas like this to return that shine to it, whilst carefully avoiding the recess, leaving it with that sort of subtle green in those areas. Once that's done, you can see we've got that really nice shine returned to all of that gold. And so now what we can do is some more layering, starting out with that green fabric. And for this, again, we want to return to the colour we used originally, which in this case is going to be Wyvern green. And to apply it, I'm sticking to my size 0 brush here. And with this, what we're now looking to do is to aim at the flatter areas whilst avoiding the creases, so the darkest parts of those. So it means at this stage we're actually going to be repainting the majority of it, but this way we'll get that nice rich green coming through once again, because right now it's a bit too dark. So with the paint ready, all we've got to do is look for those features, and what we're aiming for then is the raised up parts that are going to be like this part here on the side of his leg. So we want to apply it onto the flat area, but where it goes in on the creases, so just there for example, skip past the darkest area and carry on again on the other side. With that layer done, you can see now we've returned that nice shine to all of the banded gold armour, and also I just want to quickly point out I also painted in that trim that appears at the bottom of the green fabric, so don't forget to pick that out as well. And with that done, now what we're going to do is layer the green, and for this we want to make it a little bit brighter to help it stand out. So for this I'm going to use some emerald green, and if you want to go for a Citadel paint, then something like it is going to be Warpstone Glow. And whichever you choose with this, what we want to do is layer it onto the green fabric, so we're looking to avoid the deeper recesses, focus on the parts that stand out a little bit more. And we need to make sure we thin the paint down so it's a bit translucent to help with the layering process, so it gets a nice gradient with the colour beneath it. So thinning it down to this sort of point here where you can see it's just a bit translucent on the palette. And with this then, what we're aiming to do is to apply it onto the more raised up flatter areas and avoiding the recesses. So if you look at his leg just along here, what we want to do is apply it to areas like here on the side of his leg, so just thinly along there like that. And when we get to the recess where it arcs in for that crease, just skip past the darkest area and carry on again on the other side. Now you can see because I've got this paint thinned down and it's got that translucency about it, it's still fairly dark, which is ideal because by applying it thinly like this, you can see it dries quickly, meaning what we can now do is go back for a second coat. And this time we're going to focus it more towards the top of the fabric where the light will catch it. So we're looking at areas such as down the leg just here, again at this part just here, but now we can be more selective. So as we go around here, rather than doing the whole thing, we can just focus more towards the top of the crease, so areas like there and just here. With that, we now have that much more rich green on that fabric there, and so now we can move on to layering two of the details, starting out with that blue cloak, and this time what we're going to do is return to Kantor blue. But then what we need is some silver, so here I'm going to return to plate armour, but go back to whichever silver you used, and this is going to be to layer the sword blade. But first of all, what we need is that Kantor Blue, and to apply this one, I've gone for the size 1 brush because this is nice and easy to get to, so slightly larger brush is ideal for this sort of thing. And here what we're aiming to do is the same sort of thing as what we did on that green fabric. So we're looking for the more raised up folds in the cloth and focus on those and avoid the recesses where they'll be remaining darker. So for example, what we're looking at on the back just here is to apply the colour onto areas such as this part going all the way down here, but we're not going quite into the corner because we're just trying to leave it darker in that recess. With that blue done, we can then move on to using plate armour on the blade of his sword, and here what we're looking to do is to pick out the cutting edge. So we're looking for, it's sort of halfway across the blade. So I'm going to approach it like this, using the flat of the brush to make sure I just get that angle, so you can see how it stays dark at the back of the sword. But again, just remember to be careful because this part is delicate. With that done, you can see now it's marked out the cutting edge on the sword, helping it to appear sharp, and well, what we're now going to do is take it even further by highlighting it and the gold at the same time. And for all of this, what we need is a nice bright silver. So in this case, I'm going to use some Mythril blade, but if you want to go for a Citadel paint, you want a really bright silver, so something like Stormhost silver will do here. Whatever you choose, what you need is a really fine brush now, and I've gone right down to a size 00 from Ars Opus. But from Citadel, you might want to go for a small layer. The choice really is yours, but basically anything that's small and delicate with a fine point, and you'll be all right here. Because with this, what we're looking for now is all the sharp edges on the gold and the silver. So what we need to do is make sure the paint's thinned down for the purpose here, making sure it's a bit runny, flowing well from your brush. And remember, really importantly, just make sure you don't have loads on there so that you can keep it under control. And with this now, what we're looking for are all the edges on the gold armour. So these kind of sharper parts on the bands that you see sticking out here. Now these are a little bit tricky to get to, so all you need to do is just make sure you angle the model so that you're comfortable. Carefully move in, making sure you're bracing your hands so the brush is nice and steady, and then with the tip of the brush, just very gently follow along these raised lines along each of these bands. So just being as steady as possible, going all the way along. Now on the sword blade, what we want to do is to pick out the sharpest part of it, which is of course going to be the actual cutting edge. So in this case, what we can do is approach with the side of the brush like this and just use it to gently skim across that edge to get that really sharp highlight on the actual cutting part of it there like that. And finally, what we also need to do at this stage is to highlight the chainmail. And for this, just make sure you don't have much paint in your brush. You can always just wipe off some excess on your thumb there like that. Then just vertically go down very lightly just so it picks out a few of the links to give them a nice highlight. And once that's done, all of that gold and the silver is complete. And so now what we're going to do is move on to finishing off those green robes. And here what we need first of all is some Loren Forest, followed by some Straken Green. But we're going to be starting out with Loren Forest. And for this highlight, stick to your small brush. So I'm still using my size 00 here. And with this, what we need to do is to pick out the tops of the creases in the fabric where they stand out. So we're looking for the bits that are going to be catching the light, essentially. So what we need to do is get the paint ready. So as ever, thin down with that bit of water and just prepare to be painting some lines onto it here, so just bring the bristles together to a good point on your palette. And then we're looking for these creases, such as these ones around here. You can see that edge where it crests over and the highlight appears. What we want to do is go for that highest point and just gently pick it out with a line of this colour. Once that's done, we can move on to Straken Green for the fine highlight, still using the same brush. And here what we're looking to do is to focus the highlight towards where the light would catch it. So we're looking at sharper corners, such as just here and a little bit just along here as well. And here we have that green complete, and so with that done we can move on to highlighting all that blue fabric now. And for this what we're going to do is start out with just a quick little bit of blending to add a nice bit of volume to that cloak. And so for this the highlight we need is Altdorf Blue, but we're going to use some Kantor Blue at the same time. Now once that's done we can move on to a final highlight, and for this we're going to use some Hoeth Blue. First of all, what we need is that Altdorf Blue and also the Kantor Blue at the same time, mainly Altdorf Blue. And for this, I'm using my size 0 brush. And I'm going to start out by just getting some of the Altdorf ready on the palette. Thin down as ever with a little bit of water, so it's all ready to go. So what we want to do is bring it down to around about this point here. But then also what we need is just some Kantor Blue on standby that we can grab as we're painting the miniatures. So I'm just going to get a bit of this ready as well and put it next to that Altdorf Blue on the palette there. And what we need to do is just make sure it's nicely thinned down. So there we go. Now what I'm going to do is start out with Altdorf Blue. And in this case, what we're looking for is the tops of the creases of the fabric. So just make sure you get a good amount on there, making sure the bristles are coming to a nice point. And then what we need to do is focus on these parts, such as this crease that runs down here. So just hold the model so you're painting downwards and towards yourself, and we're just looking to do a sort of sweeping flowing motion going all the way down with a fairly broad highlight. So we just want to make it quite large there like that, and what we want to do then is just bring it out, and whilst it's still wet, just quickly grab some of that Kantor blue and just start applying it on the sides of it like this. And what we'll let the paints do is just mix as we go along, because this way you can see you get a nice smooth gradient from one colour into the other, and it starts to build up a nice highlight on that area. Once that's done and you're happy with the effect, you're then ready to move on to Hoeth Blue to add a final highlight onto the blue areas. And for this, what we're looking to do is again look for the brightest parts in the creases now and just add a final line of this colour right in the middle. And it tends to be where it flares out more, so we're looking at areas along the base of the cloak. So these parts where you can see it stands out just that a little bit more, but also be sure to continue it along the hem as well, just around that part where it's going to be brighter. So we're looking at areas such as just gently there. And with that, the blue cloak is now complete, and so we can move on to highlighting the various browns that we got on the miniature. And for this, we're going to need 3 colours. First of all, some Moonfang Brown, which is going to be used to highlight everything we originally base coated with Thondia Brown, except for the hair. But speaking of the hair, for this, what we're going to do is highlight it with Gorthor Brown to give it a different feel from the leather. Then finally, everything that originally we base coated with Moonfang Brown, we're now going to highlight using some Scragg Brown. But first of all, what we need is that Moonfang Brown on its own, and to apply it, I'm still using that size 0 brush. And with this, what we need to do is just pick out all the sharper features that appear on these details. So things like the gloves, the boots, that sort of thing. As ever, make sure the paint's thinned down and just make sure you have that control over it and that fine point. And once you're ready, we can start looking for those edges. So for example, in areas like the boots, what we want to do is to pick out the end of them, so around where the toes are. So we're looking at this sort of region just here. And also we've got these various details on it, these edges. So just follow along each one to give it a nice highlight. Once that's done, we're then ready to highlight the hair, and for this we're going to use some Gorthor Brown, and to pick out this texture, just approach using the side of your brush and just gently skim across it like this so the bristles can only catch the raised areas. This way it's very easy to pick out all of those strands. And then finally, we're ready to move on to Scragg Brown, and with this we're looking to highlight all the details that we originally base coated using Mornfang Brown. So for example, the scabbard just here, and once again we're just looking for those edges. Just want to gently pick each one out. And with all those details highlighted, we now just have one more feature left to paint on the miniature, and it is quite an obvious one. It is, of course, his face. And for this, what we're going to do is start out with a base coat of some Kislev flesh. Now, to apply it, stick to a small brush. I'm using the size 0 once again because we need to be neat as we base coat this in. You've got to avoid all those details that are surrounding it. So definitely take your time here and make sure you thin that paint down, expecting to have to apply a few coats. But if you do it this way, you'll get a smooth result and you'll have that accuracy too. So once you've got that ready and thinned down, it's just a matter of making sure your brush isn't overloaded and then just carefully moving in to pick out all of the skin. So I just want to very gently move in here to base coat all of it, and you can see what I mean about needing a few coats here because it's very thin, but this way we're going to keep the detail nice and sharp and we'll get a smooth result as well. Once you've got that base coat established, we're now ready to apply a wash over it to give it some definition and some warmth. And for here, what we need is a sort of chestnut colour wash. So I'm going to use some flesh wash for this, but if you want to use a Citadel paint, then Reikland Flesh Shade is a similar sort of colour. Whatever you choose, what we also need to do is thin it with a little bit of a medium just to take the edge off it, because there's quite a stark contrast now between the colour of the wash and the actual tone of the skin that we've got here. So I'm going to use a little bit of Lahmian medium again for this. What we need to do is just get a small amount of it. I'm using my size 0 brush again. A single brush full will do. Put that next to it on the palette and then just mix the two together to get that more diluted version of it. So we're aiming for something kind of like that. And with that mixed up then, all we got to do is just make sure there's not tons on the brush so it doesn't run out of control. And then it's just a matter of painting it all over the skin, just making sure just to keep it on the flesh and avoid getting it onto anything else. The wash is dry, so now ready for the stage of layering the skin, and for this what we need to do is return to some Kislev flesh, but this time the application is much more precise. Remember, for layering what we're looking to do is to focus on the more raised up flatter areas and avoid the recesses. So definitely make sure the paint's a little bit more thinned down than it was in the previous stage, making it quite translucent there on the palette, and also again just make sure you don't have much on your brush there so it's not going to go out of control. And then we're looking for those more raised up parts, so carefully avoiding the recesses. So for example, we start in the middle of the face here. What we're looking for is areas like the nose, and then we've got the upper lip just in here, very gently picked out with the tip of the brush. And also we've got his chin down here and that lower lip, so just very, very delicately applied. And you can see because I'm avoiding those recesses now, we're retaining the definition from the wash, and it's just giving a bit more life to the face. That layering's done, and so now we're ready to highlight the face, and for this we're going to go for two colours, starting out with some Flayed One Flesh, then going a little bit further with some Screaming Skull. But first of all we need that Flayed One Flesh, and to apply it stick to your small brush here, so still using that size 0, and with this what we're aiming to do now is to pick out the more defined features, so following the bone structure, that sort of thing, to help the expression really start to pop out. So make sure it's nice and thin and a little bit translucent on your palette, and then we're ready to start looking for these features. And for this kind of thing I always like to start by going down the nose in the middle first of all. So just very gently down the bridge of the nose, so looking at that area just there, and then following around the brow, so we just want to go across here, a little bit on the cheekbone, so looking at this area here, and then it goes down the side of the mouth too, so we want to follow it just along this area here. You can see by doing this it's just starting to emphasize that expression on the face. Another thing to do is just add a few wrinkles on his forehead, and for this it's just a matter of painting a few very thin lines along there. And then finally, we just need a little bit of Screaming Skull to emphasize the most defined features on the face. So in this case, it's going to be things such as the tip of the nose, just a little bit on his chin, so just down here, and just a bit on the eyebrows as well. Once you finish that highlight, the skin is all painted, and so now we're ready for the final features, which is to paint in the eyes. Now, when it comes to painting the eyes, especially in Lord of the Rings miniatures, it's pretty difficult, especially with these models, because they're generally a smaller scale than most Warhammer figures. So you certainly don't have to do this, but if you do want to do it, what you'll need first of all is a pitch black, followed by a pure white. So in this case, I'm going to use some Doom Death Black, followed by some White Star. But first we need Doom Death Black, and to do this go for your smallest brush. So here I've got my size 00, and what I'm going to do is just make sure this is really nicely thinned down so it's quite inky, really is what we're going for here. So thin it down to around about this sort of point here, and then just make sure that you have hardly any on your brush, so just remove it off with some tissue. Load up a small amount on there, because this way you'll have that fine tip on your brush, and then brace your hands to be as steady as possible, gently move in, and what we're looking to do is to paint a black line in the deepest recess of each eye. And finally, we just need that pure white, so here I'm using White Star, and with this what we're aiming to do is 2 dots in each eye, one at either side, so just very gently on that side just there, and then another one right in here. Now this stage is likely to have all sorts of problems and probably go a bit wrong, but don't worry if some mistakes are made. You can always adjust and neaten up and carry on until you're happy. And once you are happy, the miniature is ready to be based. And as ever, it's entirely your choice how you base it, but in this case I'm going to go for our urban rubble base with a few less bricks on it and a few more grass tufts to represent the slopes of Mount Doom. And here we have the completed Elrond miniature, ready to fight in the Battle of the Last Alliance and then tell Isildur to destroy it! So as you've seen, painting Elrond is really fun, but a key feature about him is also relevant to other High Elves too, and that is that subtle little bit of green that appears on their gold armour. It is very subtle, but if you look carefully at the movie props, you will see it. So remember just to add that shading just very slightly, just to give that hint of that colour. Anyway, have fun painting your High Elves, and we'll see you again very soon.